Okay, that's what we'll do. The Panic of 1893. Well, I hope you'll find this interesting. With this talk, we not only talk about monetary history of the 19th century, but a little bit of political trivia, too, late in the talk when we talk about some of the political figures in the great silver and gold controversies of the 1880s and 90s. Now, I don't think we'll go back as far as colonial days, except to mention that you know that America had experience with paper hyperinflation long before the greenbacks of the Civil War, or the Confederate money of the Civil War. From 1775 to 1781, we experimented in an unbacked fiat paper money known as the Continental dollar, authorizing Ben Franklin to initially print 6 million of them in 1775 to help pay for the forthcoming, at that point, potential battles with Great Britain. They printed those until they became utterly worthless in 1781, America's first experience with hyperinflation. But I want to go a little bit further, and I think we'll start with the Constitution. In fact, when I first put this talk together some years ago, under the heading, The Panic of 1893, I thought, well, I would really have to start that with a discussion of things within a few years before 93. Then the more I looked into it, the more I thought, you can't understand that development unless you go way back at least to the Constitution. So it'll become more apparent by the time I get to the end of this talk why I'm going back 100 years in order to explain something that happened in 1893. The Constitution, of course, was approved in 1789. And it did have some things to say about money that set America on a certain path that is very important to note. Our founding fathers, though they had an experience with paper money, they were not friendly to it. There is a clause in the Constitution which gives the Congress the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof. That's verbatim from the Constitution. It gives Congress the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof. There's also another part of the Constitution that indicates that the states would not have the power to make anything but gold and silver coin legal tender. So there was a bias in favor of hard money sort of baked into the Constitution. Maybe in part because our founders had that personal experience of having been burnt by the paper continental inflation of 1775 to 81. But also note that there was nothing in the Constitution that says the federal government should have a monopoly over the issue of notes. Nothing there that says that. Our founders did not envision our money being either unbacked paper or monopolized by the federal government. They just decided that we're going to have a minimal role here, and we want it to be friendly to gold and silver, but we're not going to monopolize the issue of notes. We're not even going to establish, by the Constitution, a central bank. There was no central bank created by any language in the Constitution. But it's that clause I mentioned, to coin money and regulate the value thereof, that becomes the justification for a variety of interventions by the federal government in the course of the next century and a half. So I want to disabuse you right from the start of the notion that in America's first full century, the 19th, we had a complete laissez-faire, hands-off, free market in money. We didn't. We had Congress involved from the beginning, although to nowhere near the extent that it's involved today with the institutions like the Fed that it has created. The first Treasury Secretary of the United States was a man named Alexander Hamilton. Everybody knows who he was. He was an advocate for a central bank and, in fact, established one, or convinced the Congress to establish one, called the First Bank of the United States, chartered in 1792, if memory serves, and given a 20-year life. Okay? It didn't have the kinds of powers that today's Federal Reserve has. It didn't have a monopoly over note issue. It didn't have the ability to corral the nation's private banks and determine their reserve requirements and so forth. It was nothing like the Federal Reserve of today. but it was a central bank and thought of such at that time. Hamilton did something else that plays a key role in the monetary debates of the latter part of the 19th century, long after he's gone. He established in 1792 a national policy of bimetallism. Bimetallism, two metals. It was his intent to have the law say that America would use two metals for money, gold and silver. Both would circulate side by side. That was the intent of bimetallism. The problem was, it didn't work out that way, for reasons I'll make apparent in just a moment. But to set this up, Hamilton decided, well, we have to fix the price of one metal in terms of the other. And so he said, and got congressional approval, that the price the federal government would recognize and would honor one metal in redemption for another would be 15 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold. 15 to 1, okay? Now this may sound awfully arcane to you, but it really plays a crucial role for decades to come. 15 to 1, that's what Hamilton says will be the rate at which the federal government will honor one metal in terms of the other. If you brought an ounce of gold to the mint and requested silver for it, they would give you 15 ounces. If you brought 15 ounces of silver to the mint and wanted gold for it, they'd give you an ounce of gold. If that official price, fixing the ratio, fixing the price of one metal in terms of the other, were identical to the market price, no problem, right? There'd be no incentive for people to dump one metal or the other in one place, the Treasury, over another, the marketplace. The problem was that that was not quite what the market said the two metals were worth. Hamilton had fixed the price, or the ratio, a little different from what the market said those metals were worth. Anybody know what the market ratio of silver to gold was at that time? 15.5 to 1. Now that's pretty close, right? Doesn't sound like there'd be much problem when the Treasury says 15 to 1, but the market says no, it takes 15.5 ounces of silver before you can get an ounce of gold. Doesn't sound like much difference, but if you're talking about a significant amount of one metal over another, this can add up pretty fast. As you know from earlier discussions, arbitrage becomes possible, becomes an attraction to people when they detect differences in prices. Now, even though Hamilton's intent was to have both metals circulate, have money in people's pockets in America being both gold and silver, one of the metals will quickly come to dominate and effectively push the other one out. Which one? If the market says the metals are worth 15.5 to 1, but the Treasury said no, it's 15 to 1, which one of those is undervalued at the Treasury? Gold, right? Think of it this way. If you have an ounce of gold, where do you get the most for it? The Treasury or the marketplace in terms of silver? Marketplace. An ounce of gold will get you 15.5 ounces of silver in the marketplace. You take it to the Treasury and ask for silver, they're only going to give you 15. So why take your gold to the Treasury when you can get more for it in terms of the other metal anyway, in the marketplace? So gold doesn't flow to the Treasury, contrary to Hamilton's desire. Only silver goes, because silver is artificially overvalued at the Treasury, right? The Treasury is giving you more for it. It's paying you in gold, but it's giving you more for silver at the mint than you can get for it in the marketplace. So people say, well, I won't sell my my silver for silverware. I'll take it to the mint where I get more gold for it. It only takes me 15 ounces of silver at the mint to get a full ounce of gold. So I can make money. I can turn right around and sell it in the marketplace and make a profit. So silver flows almost exclusively into the Treasury and is minted. Gold goes elsewhere, where it fetches its higher value. Marketplace uses, overseas, for monetary uses, whatever. It doesn't go to the Treasury. So even though the policy is bimetallism, this actually puts us on a mono or single metallic standard, a silver standard, a de facto silver standard from almost 1792 and for quite a few years thereafter, about 40 years. De facto silver standard. This is important, by the way. I used to, in my classes at Northwood, after a semester of economic history, I'd often ask the students, okay, I'll pick an event and you tell me what was likely to have been in Americans' pockets as money at the time of that event. What were we using as money during the War of 1812? It happens to be silver. I haven't gotten that far yet to affirm that for you, but in fact it was silver. But that was not the intent. Can anybody tell me what's the law of economics that explains why silver drove gold out of circulation as money in these early years? Right, Gresham's law. Now, Gresham's law, Greshams, apostrophe S, named for Queen Elizabeth I's economy minister, or whatever they called the top guy in money at that time in England. Gresham's law is usually presented as the following. Bad money drives good money out of circulation. Haven't you all heard it expressed that way? Bad money drives out good money. Well, this should raise a question in your mind as young Austrian economists. Why would bad money drive good money out? I mean, in every other marketplace, the good product tends to win out over the bad product. So how could this happen with money? Why would people prefer to use the so-called bad money? Well, by bad money here, we're talking about the artificially overvalued. So another way to express it is the artificially overvalued money, the one the Treasury pays too much for, that's what becomes money and drives out of circulation the other. But you should add a little proviso to that common expression of Gresham's law. It isn't just bad money drives out good money. It is bad money drives out good money when government fixes the price. Okay? When government fixes the price, and of course when that price is not the same as the market says the monies are worth. So that's what we're on now, a de facto silver standard as we leave the 18th century and move into the early part of the 19th century. Silver is predominantly America's money in the very early 1800s now. Along comes Congress in 1834. Long after Hamilton is gone, the official policy of the country is still bimetallism, but the Congress says, you know, we've never really done much with gold. It doesn't come to the mint, even though we officially say we want both metals. So let's adjust that ratio so that we can get back to having both metals in circulation. 15 to 1 apparently was a bad idea. So in 1834, Congress passes a law to change the ratio or the price of one metal in terms of the other. In the marketplace, the two metals have been remarkably stable. In 1834, it still takes, in the open marketplace, 15.5 ounces of silver to equal 1 ounce of gold. So, wouldn't you think if Congress is going to fix the price at all, they would fix it at 15.5 to 1, right? That assumes too much on the part of Congress. Instead, they thought, well, let's overcompensate. So this time they fix it at 16 to 1. Okay? Let's fix it at 16 to 1. Well, again, it's not what the market says the two metals are worth. The difference isn't great, but it's enough through arbitrage for one metal to dominate and for the other to disappear. So now, what happens to America's money as Congress fixes the new ratio at 16 to 1? What flows into the Treasury now? Gold, because you get more for it there, right? There, an ounce of silver will fetch you 16 ounces of gold. That's a good deal. Oh, wait a minute, I'm sorry. Well, I think I said that wrong, right? Yeah. 16 ounces of silver, if you take it to the mint, only gets you 1 ounce of gold. Yeah, that's correct. But in the marketplace, 16 ounces of silver will get you 1 ounce of gold, and you have a ½ ounce left. So your silver is worth more now in the marketplace than back at the mint. So gold tends to go to the mint because the Treasury is buying it from you at a price above what it's really worth. Silver goes elsewhere. So now we flip from a de facto silver standard to a de facto gold standard, okay, in 1834. Even though the policy officially is still two metals in circulation. Those of you who are interested in 19th century monetary history and think you might in the future want to do more research in this area, the 1830s is a remarkable decade. Lots of room for study here, a lot of interesting people and philosophies, and not only the policy change here with regard to the metal prices, but you had a group, it's a favorite of mine, called the Locofocos, who emerge in the 1830s. Have you ever heard of them? L-O-C-O-F-O-C-O, Locofoco. If I had been around in the 1830s and been a political activist in any way, I would have been a Locofoco. I love these people. They thought Andrew Jackson, who killed the second bank of the United States, I hadn't mentioned that yet, but I'm sure you know that when the second bank of the U.S. was created in 1816 and given a 20-year life, it was Andrew Jackson, late in that period, who effectively blocked its recharter. So the second attempt at central banking in the U.S. Went kaput in 1836 when Andrew Jackson killed the second bank and said, we don't want the central government in the banking business. Well, the Locofocos were of his party, the Democratic Party, but they thought he was too moderate. I mean, they were even more in a hard money, limited government persuasion than Andrew Jackson was. This was a party that started out with the name Equal Rights Party because their philosophy was that government should treat everybody equally, no special favors for anybody. Keep it small, keep it confined to doing the things that need to be done for everybody, like provide a system of justice. Beyond that, that's it. No special favors for everybody. To them, that's what equal rights meant. And they saw things like central banking as government sort of getting into certain businesses, handing out special favors, to the bankers, in those days, to set up a corporation in the state of New York, I'm not sure how common this was in other places, it required an act of the legislature. The legislature had to decide to allow you to incorporate in New York State. So you had people who would block this or that group from starting a company because they didn't like them. And so that later led to the general incorporation laws across the country where, look, if you fill out a form and provide just basic information, you can go in business, and the market will decide whether you survive, not politicians. The Equal Rights Party was formed in part because they wanted to make sure everything was equal, no special favors, and they were against central banking. They got that name, by the way, because of a convention in New York City in the late 1830s. The Locofocos, not yet called that name, but the faction that would become them, they were duking it out with the Tammany Hall Democrats. And at a convention, the Tammany Hall Democrats were the more establishment and thoroughly corrupt in many cases. They saw the Locofocos as really out there, too ideological and what have you. So they were always duking it out with them. And at a particular convention, the Tammany Hall Democrats left the convention in disgust with these reformers. And as they left, they blew out the gas lights. So the hall was dark, and the only folks who were left were these radical, hard money, anti-central planning, laissez-faire Democrats. And there was a new invention at the time called the Locofoco. It was a kind of match. It meant crazy lights. Locofoco meant crazy lights in Spanish. Well, they relit the convention hall with these matches, and somehow that name stuck. These now became the Locofocos. So they're worthy of a lot of study because they had some colorful figures arguing strenuously for laissez-faire principles, limited government, and sound money in the 1830s. Well, with the end of the second bank of the United States, the inauguration now of a de facto gold standard, we have an era of relative free banking in the country until the National Banking Act of the Civil War, which was passed, I think, in 62 or 63. That meant that you didn't have a central bank in Washington. Banks were free. They could issue their own notes. You might say, well, what about some banks? Didn't they overdo it and excessively inflate and fool people and then maybe go broke and drag people down with them? Yeah, there was a little bit of that, but you know what is most amazing is how the marketplace took care of some of this. This is worthy of further study too if you are into monetary history. The Suffolk System, Suffolk, arose, a private institution, private organization, stemming from the Suffolk Bank in Massachusetts. They were a very sound bank. They didn't inflate. They were a rock of integrity. But it bothered them that there were some other banks on the frontier and scattered around the country that overissued, that were printing dollars, but really overdoing it. They didn't have the gold to back it up. So what did the Suffolk System do? It was in their interest to expose these bad inflationary practices of their sister banks, right? Because after all, we're all printing dollars, and when somebody overdoes it and cheats, it devalues the product of the other bank that's also issuing dollars. So what does the Suffolk Bank do? It creates a network of redemption riders. These were men on horseback who took piles or bags of the paper dollars issued by these inflating banks. As these notes would circulate elsewhere in the country, the Suffolk Bank would accumulate them, put them in a big bag, and say to the rider, now go to that bank and demand, as the note promises, demand gold for the notes. In other words, blow the whistle on them. Call their bluff. And they put some of these banks out of business by being quick to request the redemption that the notes promised, but that the banks couldn't come through with because they had excessively issued paper money. Remarkable market institution to make banks honest and keep the currency sound. The 1860s is, of course, a period of great monetary mischief and turmoil. With the coming of the Civil War, you have now two parts of the country dealing with money in a crisis atmosphere. And in the South, of course, they're desperate to keep their independence. The South very quickly will resort to unbacked fiat money, which will, by 1865, become utterly worthless. Milton Friedman has often talked about how you could actually chart Southern prices and see that the spikes came before a Southern printing press was overrun by the Union Army. And when word of that happened, prices sort of leveled off. But when the Confederates then started up another place and printed more money, then prices took off again. But by 1865, partly because they had overissued and partly because they lost the war, Southern Confederate money became completely worthless, impoverishing many people, wiping out their savings if they had kept it in Confederate money. The North also overissued, greenbacks. They went off the de facto gold standard. Lincoln felt that, hey, we got to have more money and we can't get it all from tax revenue, so we need more freedom to print the stuff. And so we did. And the greenbacks lost considerable value. Now we start to get close to the Panic of '93 because the greenback experience plays a central role in the coming of the Panic of 1893, 30 years later, believe it or not. As I mentioned, the North issued a lot of greenbacks in the Civil War with the promise someday to redeem them in gold. Okay? They hoped that people would accept them, and they did for the most part, although they depreciated substantially. But the promise was, someday when this war is over, we will redeem those notes in gold. So after the war, it took Congress a while, but they had to come to grips with this issue. What are we going to do with all the greenbacks? We promised people that if you accept them, we'll someday give you gold for them. You could say, well, Congress probably did the dishonest thing and just said, sorry, we fooled you, we're not going to do that. But in fact, they did take a step towards monetary integrity and pass something that I think is a model for monetary honesty. It passed in 1875, 10 years after the war, and it was called the Specie, S-P-E-C-I, S-P-E-C-I-E, Resumption Act. Anytime somebody asks you, is it feasible for America ever to restore convertibility into a precious metal? Have we ever done that? Here's an act you can point to. You can say, yes, we actually did it. We went off a gold standard and printed lots of paper, but then there was a time when we actually said, we're going to stop doing that and we're going to restore gold convertibility. It was the Specie Resumption Act of 1875. Here's what it did. It declared that all greenbacks would be redeemable in gold at par, in other words, at the rate we promised that the note itself said. We're not going to cheat you. We're not going to give you 10 cents on the dollar. We're going to pay you back at par what we promised, beginning on the 1st of January, 1879. Okay, Congress gave itself 4 years to make sure they had sufficient gold reserves. They really did even as early as 1875, but they built them up more so that the public would have confidence that now the greenback dollar was in fact as good as gold. When that day arrived, 1st of January 1879, I would guess few banks, if any, were even open, but the next day anyway, what do you think happened at the nation's banks? First time in years that the promise to pay in gold, to redeem those notes in gold, would be honored. What do you think happened on January 2nd, 1879 at the banks? A run on the banks? Hardly anybody showed up at the banks with their greenbacks and demanded gold. Why? Because they actually believed that Congress meant it. And it was widely known that the gold reserves were there. Banks were prepared to honor the redemption. As a story, it may be apocryphal, but I know it was reported, written about at the time, about a man supposedly in New York City who showed up at a bank with $500 in greenbacks, asked for gold. They put the gold in front of him, and he said, forget it, can't carry it, and walked out with his paper money. Now, what does that say? A gold standard doesn't have to mean that the only thing that circulates as money are bits of gold in people's pockets. It may well be paper, but the paper has some connection with the gold behind it. And when people have confidence that if they really want the metal, they can get it upon demand, they might well prefer to use the paper receipts. More convenient, easier to carry. That was the case in 1879. Congress had succeeded in restoring gold convertibility at an honest price. It said, what we promised is what we're going to give you now. We're not going to cheat you on those greenbacks. Now you might say, wow, hallelujah. There's a great model of monetary honesty here with the Specie Resumption Act. But as so often is the case with politicians, what they give you with the right hand, they take with the left. Or they muck up at the same time they fix up. And so in the same decade that Congress is passing this official legislation to restore sound money and gold convertibility, they're actually passing other legislation that will undo this, that compromises it. And there's a group of people in the country, then at that time called greenbackers. They actually form a political party. They don't like Congress moving in the direction of sound money. The Greenback Party is formed in the 1870s to combat this drift towards sound money because its people think that, no, the road to prosperity is through the printing of money. We need more money, not less of it. And many of the people behind this were debtor farmers in the South and in the West who felt that going to gold would mean price stability and maybe even price deflation. And they had such great debts that they had an interest in seeing prices go up. They had an interest in paying off their debts in depreciating money. They weren't interested in sound money. Well, at first, the greenbackers had no success whatever. The country had just been burned by paper inflation. If you lived in the South, your paper money went to nothing. If you lived in the North, your greenbacks depreciated by 50, 60%, something like that. And Congress is moving in the other direction, so the greenbackers don't get very far. They are seen as the inflationists that they were, and that had a negative connotation. So what do they decide rather quickly to switch to? If you're a greenbacker and you think that the money supply has to grow in order for the country to have a prosperous economy, but you can't get it done through paper money, you got to find something else. What did they latch on to? Silver. The greenbackers become silverites. The silverites of the late 1870s and 1880s and early 1890s. Silverites. These are people who think we got to inflate the economy. It's good for it. It will help us retire our debts quicker and with cheap money and stimulate the economy. You had a whole raft of monetary cranks who were producing pamphlets praising the virtues of monetary inflation. But because they couldn't get it done with paper, they switched to silver, and they thought, if only we can get the Congress to buy up lots of silver and mint it and then issue paper money backed by that so we can get both silver and paper circulating as money, we can expand the nation's money supply and get the same inflationary effect, but people will think it's tied to silver. That sounds like sound money. They'll be more likely to go for it. The problem at first was that Congress had taken off the books in 1873 any provision for the coinage of silver. And so the silverites, they start saying this was a crime. You know, the law doesn't allow for the coinage of silver. That has to be changed. So they start agitating, and their first big victory, believe it or not, is in 1878. Even before the Specie Resumption Act takes effect and we restore that gold convertibility, already Congress is undoing it. In 1878, they passed the Allison Act, Bland-Allison, Allison, the Bland-Allison Act, which required the Congress to buy, or the Treasury to buy, $2 to $4 million worth of silver every month and mint it at 16 to 1 against gold and issue paper silver certificates, legal tender, alongside. So you got silver, silver dollars, and paper certificates now, paper dollars flooding the economy because of the Bland-Allison Act. The Treasury was required every month you will have to buy $2 to $4 million worth of silver, mint it at 16 to 1, and issue paper money at the same time. So we begin this inflationary policy even before the gold convertibility of the greenbacks takes effect. But this is going to cause a problem because guess what? 16 to 1 is not what the market says. Does this ring a bell? Is not what the market says the two metals are worth. Guess what's happening to silver by the 1870s? That ratio that I had mentioned of 15.5 to 1 had been remarkably stable for decades, decade upon decade. Silver against gold was remarkably stable at 15.5 ounces to 1. But by the 1870s, silver's value on world markets begins a drastic decline. Anybody know why? There are a number of central banks, India, Germany, that abandon silver and start going to gold, so their demand for silver goes down. Argentina floods the market with silver. I'd forgotten that, but I'm sure you're right. But we also did the same thing. I'm thinking of what's the great silver discovery? Yes, sir. Yeah, the Comstock lode in Nevada. So silver's declining in value. Nations are beginning to desert silver and go to a monometallic gold standard. So the demand for gold goes up, the demand for silver goes down. At the same time, its supply is going up dramatically. So by the 1870s, the market says it takes 18 ounces of silver to equal an ounce of gold, then 20 ounces of silver. It continues to fall while Congress now is authorizing an official price of 16 to 1. That is going to threaten the redemption of those greenbacks, isn't it? Because if the market says, no, silver's worth less and less, but the Congress says, no, we're buying it at 16 to 1, this has the potential of flipping America back to a de facto silver standard. Now, you might think $2 to $4 million a month, that's not a whole lot, but it was a fair amount of silver. But this angers the Silverites because one Treasury Secretary after another of both parties doesn't like the Bland-Allison Act, and they buy the bare minimum that the law allows, just the $2 million worth every month. So the Silverites continued to mount political pressure. They want what is known as free silver at 16 to 1. Have you heard that slogan before? There were major political battles for Congress, and the Senate fought in the late 70s and 80s over that slogan, free silver at 16 to 1. What they meant was they wanted Congress to buy as much silver as anybody would take to them and honor it at 16 to 1 against gold at a time when silver is worth less and less and less. In fact, by 1890, the world is so flooded with silver that the market ratio is in excess of 30 ounces to 1 ounce of gold at a time when the Treasury is still buying it, subsidizing it, minting it one against the other at 16 to 1. How ridiculous. So what people are saying, in effect, by the late 1880s is, wow, in the marketplace it takes so much silver, 30 ounces, to get an ounce of gold, but those suckers at the U.S. Treasury will give you an ounce of gold for only 16. So silver's going to rush to the mint, gold will be drained, and as the gold reserves decline, that puts in jeopardy the promise of the Specie Resumption Act to keep the backing solid for those greenbacks. So this begins to raise questions about how sound is America's financial system when greenbacks are being issued and promised to be redeemed in gold, but the Treasury's reserves are falling through the floor. They're getting flooded with silver, not with gold. The silver is falling in value. Well, in 1890, the Congress really goes off the deep edge. The Silverites get their biggest victory to date with the passage of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890. I'll tell you about that in a moment, but give me an idea about time. How are we on time? Okay, and that includes Q&A. Okay. 1890, the Silverites really have enough votes, and they push through the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. Sherman, of course, is the same guy who in the same year gave us the Sherman Antitrust Act, so this guy's bad news for multiple reasons. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act requires the Treasury to buy 4.5 million ounces of silver every month and mint it at 16 to 1. Now, I'll explain the significance of that in a moment, but it requires the Treasury to buy 4.5 million ounces of silver every month. Notice the difference in the way they express those two laws, Bland-Allison in 1878, Sherman Silver Purchase Act in 1890. In the case of the first, it was expressed as a dollar amount. You have to buy $2 to $4 million worth. 1890, they say you have to buy 4.5 million ounces. How do you compare that? Well, 4.5 million ounces in 1890 represented almost the entire output of American silver mines. So think of it. It meant that the U.S. Treasury now was almost the exclusive buyer of all American silver. It was paying twice for it what it was worth, subsidizing it courtesy of the taxpayer. And at the same time, that act provided for something called Treasury Notes of 1890, which was paper money, silver certificates, backed by silver. But you could also get gold for it at 16 to 1. So this accelerates the influx of silver into the mint and the exodus of gold. It jeopardizes America's de facto gold standard at a time when we're really coming of age in a lot of ways. We have a ton of British investors who've put a lot of money in the American economy. After 1890, they say, we're getting out of here. These people are nuts. British capital flows out of the country because the feeling is America's got its financial house in terrible shape. They're not going to be able to maintain redemption in gold for their money. They're going on to a depreciating silver standard. Their treasury's going to go bust. I mean, this is nuts. But this was passed in 1890. Now, this leads me to the introduction for you of a man I regard as my favorite president because he played a key role in fixing this problem. And I'm talking about Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland was America's 22nd and 24th president, the only one to serve 2 terms that were not consecutive. He was our second heaviest president at about 270 pounds. The only heavier one was William Howard Taft, who weighed in at about 350 and had to be pried out of the White House bathtub, really, on one occasion. A few years ago, there was a traveling exhibit that made its way to Grand Rapids, Michigan, of personal effects of all of our presidents. They had 2 or 3 things that belonged to each president from George Washington on display. And one of the Taft things was the new bathtub that they had to build him when he couldn't get out of the other one that was in the White House. So this was quite a... anyway, Grover Cleveland, I'll leave that to your imagination. Grover Cleveland had been president once before by 1890. He was elected first in 1884. And would you believe I actually met his son? I should pause and tell you about this. I met his son in 1995. His name was Francis Cleveland, named for his mother. And he was born in 1903 when Grover had been gone from the White House for 6 years. He left his second term in 1897, and he was 67 years of age as a former president when he and his wife had their 5th child in 1903, and that's who I met in 1995. I was reading an almanac of American politics, and it had trivia about every president in there, and the names of their children, and their birth dates, death dates, and where they lived. And under Grover and Francis Cleveland, it had the 5 children, and it meant the 5th one, Francis, was born in 1903, and it had no death date, and it said Tamworth, New Hampshire. And I thought, could this guy still be living? He'd be the oldest living child of an American president. So I got information for a Francis Cleveland from by dialing the area code, got his number, and a man answered, and I said, "Is this Francis Cleveland?" And he said, "Yes, it is." And I said, "Son of the former president?" He said, "That's me." And I got so excited because I had written about him and about his dad and didn't realize he had a kid still living. And I said, "Well, I'm coming to New York this summer in July and August, and after one of those trips, I'd like to rent a car, drive up to see you. Could I do that?" And here's what he said at age 92. He said, "Well, I started a performing arts company here in Tamworth 65 years ago called the Barnstormers. I'm still directing it. I'm completely booked in July. Can you come in August?" At 92. So a colleague of mine, Bert Folsom, and I went up and spent an evening with him. And I said at one point, I said, "Francis, you have to understand what a thrill this is for us to be talking to a man whose father, not grandfather, whose father was first elected president of the United States 111 years ago. It just didn't seem possible. His dad's elected in 1884, and here I am in 1995 talking to his kid." And he said, "That's nothing. Clevelands tend to marry late. They have children late." He said, "My grandfather, Grover's dad, was an infant when Thomas Jefferson was in the White House." It's hard to believe. Anyway, so we spent an evening talking to him, but let me tell you about his dad and how he plays into this. Grover had been elected in 1884, and he was a sound money man. He made sure that his Treasury Secretary bought the bare minimum of that silver required under the 1878 Bland-Allison Act. He lost his bid for re-election in 1888, not because he didn't get as many votes as the other guy. He actually won in the popular votes, but lost in the Electoral College, one of only 4 times that's happened. And Benjamin Harrison, the Republican, gets in. He's the president who's in office and in 1890 and signs into law so much bad legislation. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act, the Sherman Antitrust Act, the McKinley Tariff that raised tariffs. Terrible president. And in 1892, Grover Cleveland says, "I got to come back and try to fix this." So he runs in 1892 against the man who beat him, the incumbent Benjamin Harrison, and wins his second term and is due to take office in March of 1893 when there are ominous signs of pending economic collapse. I can't think of a more inauspicious moment for a new president to take office than a panic-like atmosphere. When the gold reserves are being drained, we're awfully close to the minimum required by law. Capital is fleeing the country, and Grover Cleveland takes office. He valiantly tries to shore up the gold reserves, but it's for naught. And within a few weeks, the gold reserves fall below an important level and spark a panic, which leads to a deep depression, the Panic and Depression of 1893. By June of 93, we have 16% unemployment in the United States. And it's about that time when Grover Cleveland, knowing what has to be done, we've got to repeal the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. He's solid as a rock on this. He knows that stuff has got to go. No more subsidizing silver, printing paper money, undermining the sanctity of contracts made in gold and so forth. We've got to get rid of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. He's about to call the Congress into session, special session, to repeal it in June of 93 when he notices a bump in his mouth on his upper palate. And it's bothersome enough he sees his physician. And it's diagnosed as malignant cancer. Well, here's the problem. The country's gripped by a panic, 16% and rising unemployment. And we've got a nutcase for vice president. We can't have the country worried about this man becoming vice president. You know, in those days, the presidential nominee usually didn't pick his running mate. That was done by the convention, party convention, and often they picked somebody to balance the ticket. The man they put on the ticket with Grover Cleveland in 92 was named Adlai Stevenson, the grandfather of the Adlai Stevenson that you may know from the 1950s. And Adlai Stevenson was a Silverite inflationist, just the opposite of Cleveland. So what's Cleveland to do now? He can't have the country worried about the president's health, and it is a very serious situation. So he holds off on calling the Congress into session, and he goes off onto a boat on the East River. Would it occur to you to have an operation like this done on a boat? On the East River in New York, where the team of doctors will go in, not this way because they didn't want to leave a visible scar. They went in this way, took out his upper palate, most of his upper jaw, removed the tumor, which you can see to this day, by the way. It's in a jar. It is. You can see it. It's in a jar in the Mutter Museum of Medical Oddities in Philadelphia. I've seen it. You can see Grover Cleveland's tumor. They replace his jaw with a prosthetic of vulcanized rubber and do it so well on that boat, of all places, that by August, nobody knows. I mean, he looks just fine, and he calls the Congress into special session to get the job done on the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. And there's a new book out, by the way, called The President is a Sick Man. It just came out about a month ago. And it's the story of this operation, this secret operation. And the cancer never recurred in Cleveland. It was that successful. So he pushes hard to get the repeal of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, and by the end of October of 93, that does in fact happen. We repeal that, and the country at least says officially, we're going to restore gold as money, not have subsidies of silver and lots of paper. The problem is the Depression's going to linger for another 2 or 3 years because you had so much agitation, political agitation, to restore the old silver and paper stuff. Who's the guy who actually takes over Cleveland's party in 1896 on a platform of free silver at 16-1 and lots more inflation? William Jennings Bryan actually snatches the Democratic Party away from the Cleveland Gold Standard Democrats. Fortunately, he doesn't win. William McKinley does, and in 1900 we passed the Gold Standard Act, which officially, at least for a while, gets us out of that silver subsidy, paper money business and affirms a monometallic gold standard. Now, those are just the highlights of 19th century monetary history with a little emphasis there on the Panic of '93. I hope you found that interesting. I do want to give you time for questions. And I'll just say, read more about Grover Cleveland. He's a model for America in many ways, and arguably one of, if not our best, of our 44 presidents. Thank you. Are there questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, what was the purpose of the bimetallic monetary system? Was it just not enough bullion in one?
What was the purpose of the bimetallic system in the first place, right under Hamilton? Yeah, there were differing views on this, but some argued that there just wouldn't be enough if we picked only one. Others argued, well, that we've had a history of using both, although more silver in colonial days than gold. And there just wasn't an automatic, obvious reason to freeze one metal out. So they thought, well, they both serve well as money in various places and times, let's use them both. It's just that the policy had the opposite effect. Up there's a hand. Back row.
It's not something exactly in your lecture, but I know Spanish pesos, silver pesos were very used till the middle of the 19th century in the U.S.
Yes.
How do they fit in?
The Spanish milled dollar, as it was called, was used. That was the biggest argument for at least making sure silver stayed in circulation, because it was a silver coin and was the most widely used in the colonies and in the early days of the Republic. The Spanish milled, M-I-L-L-E-D dollar. I think the Spanish milled dollar emerged because it was reliable and stable in value. Silver was more plentiful, and it had good record. Yeah, before we even started minting our own, Americans were using Spanish milled dollars. Yes, sir.
So I have a question about everything you explained. Like today, how are the banks held accountable? Because they a lot of the money that we hold are in like bank accounts or we pay a lot of things with debit or credit cards. So it's a lot of this digitized information, which represents currency. And if the currency is backing our bank accounts, what's backing the currency, and why is Ben Bernanke printing more money? Is that to back what the banks, because the banks overvalue the currency, right? Which is the problem, because they don't let people people can't hold the banks accountable for how much currency they have. So how does all the concepts that you explained during the 19th century, how can we apply that and learn from that today?
Okay, good question. This allows me to give you also a kind of wrap up. What's the big principle or lesson we might learn from experiences of 19th century monetary history? It's a very different lesson than you might have been taught in school. How many were taught some version of this? That the 19th century, because it was such an era of laissez-faire, there were a lot of chaotic things going on, and we can blame that on laissez-faire. And one of them was confusion of money. And so we had to eventually have a Federal Reserve and central banking and single money issued from Washington to bring bring order out of the chaos of the 19th century. Didn't you get some version of that, most of you, in school? Well, when you look at the actual record, what do you find? There was a lot of monetary mischief at the time, and a lot of this expansion and mismanagement of the money supply also played a part in the boom and bust cycles of the period. So if anything, the lesson you should learn from the so-called era of laissez-faire is that we didn't have anywhere near the laissez-faire that we could have had, and that the mischief and the problems that we did have largely stemmed from a departure from market principles and the adoption of government central planning over money, whether it be in the form of unbacked paper greenbacks or Confederate money or subsidizing silver. I mean, government was all over the place. So before anybody, if you ever hear a professor or a teacher tell you, oh, we had panics and depression in the 19th century because we had too much freedom in money and banking, you can start rattling off some of these things and say, well, how do you explain all this stuff? They were all over the place, but subsidizing silver. Today, of course, money and so-called near monies that you spoke of, things like credit cards, it really is there's a marketplace of various tools and devices and forms of money. We're still a long way from any kind of laissez-faire situation, obviously, but to me, I look at that and I say, isn't it marvelous? The extent to which, even when you have massive government intervention, you still have great innovation coming from private firms, creating credit cards that have reliability, that you can pay for things in from all over the world. at a time when the U.S. government is undermining confidence in its main product, the dollar, you have lots of confidence in the private use of privately issued near monies and forms of payment like credit cards. To me, that says, hey, maybe we ought to look at even more private provision and competition in this whole business of media of exchange. Stephen, one example I'm sure you would agree with of intervention is in the form of the occasional suspension of specie payments, where you'd have an inflating bank in effect cheating its depositors by over-issuing paper notes, and instead of bearing the full brunt of the market verdict on their mischief, you'd have state governments come in sometimes and say, well, yeah, we're going to allow this bank to suspend its specie payments. We're going to allow it, in effect, to defraud its depositors. And, in a marketplace where contract is upheld, you don't do that. You throw the book at them. But you had government often intervening in that way to prevent the kind of market discipline that would have kept overissuance by some of these banks to a minimum.
Can you explain the Wizard of Oz and its connection to the Silverites?
I've heard, the Yellow Brick Road. I've heard that, I don't know the extent to which it's true that Frank Baum wrote it because he was trying to make some kind of an allegory around the gold-silver controversies of that period. I don't know if that's true or not. Anybody know if it is? Jim? It is true? Okay, and the Yellow Brick Road meant...
There's a lot of speculation back and forth, but apparently he was looking at both the different groups. So like the Emerald City was like the politicians, the Wicked Witch and the Yellow Brick Road and everything that was going on there was like the bankers, and they were demonized.
Oh, okay.
And then, you have the Silverite farmers going on there, and that's why her slippers were originally silver. Because there's this imaginary thing that, silver, is going to take you to the Emerald City, and it's going to solve all these problems. And then you have the wizard, or the wizard behind the curtain. So.
Okay. Yeah.
Google the Wizard of Oz as a monetary allegory.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll have to do that too.
Yeah.
I've heard.
There's actually a good paper also from the Cato Institute that talks about it. I don't remember the name of it, but maybe if you search Wizard of Oz Cato, you can find it.
So Frank Baum deliberately wrote it with that in mind. It was not something.
There's some controversy whether how deliberate it was.
Yeah.
And whether these parallels really were there or whether it was sort of seeking this.
Okay.
Look up your own mind.
I think it was actually reported that if Frank Baum retweeted or not, that there was any other anything else other than this.
Okay. Question? Thanks, Paul. That's good. We have time for any others?
Yeah, we got time.
Okay. There's a hand here. Patrick.
In light of all the, some of those acts you were saying, that kind of government was promising people gold for their greenbacks on one hand, but on the other hand, they passed the Bland Allison Act and other acts. I don't know, it seems to me some of that public choice stuff has to come up, because I don't understand how these acts that are so deliberate were being passed unless the people in Congress had already been starting to be corrupted by some of these lobbying forces. Have you looked into any of that?
Oh, yes, there was plenty of that. I mean, if you've ever taken the standard tour of your state capitol where you have the summer intern explaining how, this is how government works. Everybody comes here with the best of intentions, and they sit down and they hash out their differences, and they think of what's best for the country and pass what is good for all of us. That's hogwash. These guys don't check their personal interests at the door when they become a member of Congress. And the Silverites in particular were gathering influence and power as the century wore on, because where were we adding states to the Union from? Out west. You had new mining states come on board, and typically the senators from those states, of course, would support a federal subsidy for one of their primary products coming from their state. So by the 1880s, you got a lot of states out west where silver mining is important, and so those senators could be counted on to support a subsidy for silver. So yeah, there's a lot of that horse trading and stuff going on. You know how I see that, by the way? I'm constantly blown away by how so many people grow up thinking the government always has the best of intentions. And I see the way it actually operates, and I realize, as the public choice economists have told us, that there's nothing about being elected to Congress that suddenly means you're interested only in everybody else's long-term welfare and you're no longer interested in your own. And with so much power and money, even closer now to your fingertips, it's tough for these guys to resist any of that. I see that as a reason to keep government small in the first place. Because when it gets so big and it starts to pass out all these favors to people, there is no way to fix that. No way to fix it except shrinking it. Shrinking the size and the scope and the duties of government. And no amount of campaign finance laws and well-meaning touchy-feely reforms is going to fix a system that's fundamentally busted because there's too much power centered in the hands of too few. Question here?
You mentioned this arbitrage between the market price for market exchange between silver and gold and then the Treasury's exchange rate. What if they hadn't set that exchange rate? How would they have known what the market price was if the Treasury didn't want to have an arbitrary price?
Good question. Could Hamilton have, instead of having a fixed price, could he have had a floating one that recognized at any given day what the real price was? Well, certainly that would have made a bimetallic standard more sustainable. If they had simply decided, look, we're going to, on any given day, we'll honor one metal in terms of the other by the market price, it would have been much more sustainable than fixing it and keeping it there for decades when market prices were very different. Absolutely. But it raises the fundamental question, too, about, well, what should be the proper role of government in money? And although there are differences among Austrians, as you know, generally speaking, we think monetary reform lies in the direction of putting market forces in charge of the situation as opposed to politicians. In fact, I don't know that the government needs to do anything more in money than it does, say, in weights and measures, where we say, for definition purposes, because we have to enforce contracts, a yardstick is 36 inches. A pound is 16 ounces. But the government doesn't say, but we will create yardsticks and we will be the producer of scales. No, anybody can create scales and sell them and create yardsticks. Just don't cheat. Don't sell a yardstick that's only 35 inches. As long as you meet the definition, as long as you're honest, full disclosure, anybody can make yardsticks or scales. And I think really in money, I don't see why it should be any different. I don't even think, frankly, I don't know if Steve would disagree, but I don't think you need a definition from government either, that would work itself out in the marketplace naturally. But, at the most, it might say, this is what a dollar is. And as long as you meet the definition, you can mint it, print it, whatever. I think in a free society, it should not be a crime to be honest about what you create, money or anything else. We have time for another? Yeah. Okay. I don't have a watch, so I'm relying upon you all to tell me when I'm okay.
In allowing banks to mint their own dollars, is there sort of an increased risk of Confederate money? People...
Counterfeit money, you mean?
Counterfeit money, excuse me.
Confederate money. The South shall rise again.
I've been in Georgia too long. But yeah, counterfeit money. Is there an increased risk of counterfeit money with like a free banking system?
Is there an increased risk of counterfeit money if money is all handled privately? I doubt it, but I'm not. I don't know if, Steve, you have a feeling about this. I would think that it would be in such, the private issuers would have such incentive to create money that couldn't be counterfeited. They'd probably be more innovative and on the cutting technological edge than government has been.
And they were historical.
And they were historically. Okay. Ah, okay. Yeah, I don't see any inherent reason why they would issue money more easily counterfeitable than government.
All you have to look at your credit card, how many different ways there are to prevent
Ah, you got the security number on there, you got, yeah. Yeah. In fact, private enterprise is so creative at counterfeiting government money, I think they would turn that ingenuity to preserving the integrity of their own.
Well, I just wanted to bring up the issue in terms of counterfeiting money today. A lot of that has to do with computer science majors. So if a really smart computer science guy decides to be a hacker, then, I mean, there's no stopping him from stealing credit. Like, for example, there was one guy who stole 0.01 of a cent of every transaction Bank of America did.
Really?
And he ended up making millions and millions of dollars, and nobody noticed until he turned himself in just to brag.
Wow.
So, I mean, just because the companies are in their self-interest, they think they're creating something, like, there's just as many people who will, who are just smart and they just want to have fun with them.
Oh,
Or they just want
yeah.
to steal money. I mean, just the counterfeiting thing, I don't think it necessarily makes it safer, but it does make it harder. But there's, I mean, it's still going to be, money's still going to be stolen.
I'm sure you're right, that it would always be a problem to some degree. But the only answer to that is, when you find it, throw the book at them. But that's the risk you run when you allow not just people privately to produce something. I mean, we're counterfeiting government money now, so I don't know that the problem would be any greater, but it would never go away. Yep. You just have to stay technologically a step ahead of the counterfeiters, I guess.
Time for one more question.
Is a hand here?
Somebody down here keep trying to raise their hand.
Could you just elaborate a bit on the aftermath of the hyperinflation of the Continental dollar and sort of the monetary system in place just immediately following it?
Yes, the hyperinflation of the Continental dollar. I did a piece for the Freeman on this that will come up if you go to our the Freeman page and just type in hyperinflation Continental dollar would probably do it. Or the title of the article was the Times That Tried Men's Economic Souls. And there's so much you could say about it, but I'll tell you what I think is one of the most salient lessons of that 5.5-year period of hyperinflation in America. A couple lessons. One is, even the best of men, with the best of intentions, after all, these were our founding fathers, Second Continental Congress members who authorized Ben Franklin to start the printing process. So they thought at first, we'll just keep it to $6 million. That's what they thought they were going to limit it to. And Ben said, that's it, we're not going to do any more than that. In no time at all, they authorized another 13 million, another 50 million. I got all the figures in that article, but before it was all done, they just kept printing the stuff. And then state governments, until shortly before colonial governments, they, in response to the price inflation, many of them put in place price controls. And so you had the odd circumstance during the winter of 1777-78 at Valley Forge, where you had George Washington and his men on one side of whatever the river was, Delaware, freezing and starving. Meantime, the British, 3,000 miles from home on the other side of the river, living well because lots of local farmers were selling provisions to them because they were paying an honest money, not in the price-controlled environment of with paper inflated money that the Congress insisted on printing. The fortunes of the war began to change, not coincidentally, when we started to get more honest in the money that we were using to pay for our provisions. So you could make a case, I think, pretty strong that when we got honest with money, we started to win some battles and the war was over. It might be a bit of a stretch, but I think the paper money was a hindrance, not a help to winning the colonial cause. With that, I want to say thank you for sitting through an unexpected lecture and appreciate your attentiveness. And thanks again for coming this week, and I hope you enjoy the remainder of the seminar too. Thank you.